I want to tell you a little bit about who we are and about what our commitments are. I've been doing this work for almost 26 years. And I've been doing social investing, which means that, back when I started, the issues were some of the things that in some ways you all will know about, and that is divestment from South Africa and trying to bring down apartheid in South Africa. This is the cool thing to do now. All the big Wall Street firms have kind of swallowed this. But the reality is, the reason they're doing it is because they're figuring out that not investing in coal anymore is not a good financial thing. So what they're doing is that they're taking, we used to call it socially responsible investing. Now but the people in New York City and all the big people didn't like that. You know why? Because socially responsible has a moral implication to it. If there are things that are socially responsible, there are things that are socially irresponsible. So they now will talk about it. You may have heard it. Does anybody know what ESG? Has anybody heard those terms? No. They don't like to talk about socially responsible investing anymore. They want to talk about ESG investing, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. And all those things are very good things. But the reality is, it's no longer for them a moral issue or not. One of the other things we'll always say is, why do we do what we do? Is because we want to see social change happen. They don't want to talk about social change, and they don't want to talk about morals. They want to talk about that environmental, social, and governance factors now are great risk metrics and do have an effect on the bottom line of the companies. In other words, it's just another way for them, in many ways, it's another way they can make sure that they can make the absolute most money they can. We were taught how to bring our money to church, right? And give it. But the reality is, we have not asked the questions of how can we make the other 90%, or even more than that, work on behalf of the social issues and the social questions that we care about. And how can we make that money work also? You guys do lots of stuff with that money that you give, but we have 90%. We have lots and lots of money out there that are invested in some places. In many cases, I know people, you don't even know how bad it is. Because this, for us, is not just a social issue, it's a faith issue. That's where we're coming from, and that's why we were so excited when we were asked to come and be with you today.
I'm Joel, and I'm going to focus on the fossil fuel-free component of our discussion today. I think probably most of us would agree that climate change is the paramount concern of our world today. If we don't take steps to slow and mitigate damage to the environment, the world will continue to experience ever greater natural disasters that will eventually make the planet uninhabitable. I think we see this in the news every day. If we watch the news every day, maybe we don't, for good reason perhaps, but we see more and more drier conditions, especially in the West, which lead to wildfires and the destruction they cause. And then more in the East, we see ever stronger and more frequent hurricanes each year. And then if we look even farther west to the eventual East with Asia and the Pacific Rim, we see more and more extremely destructive tsunamis and typhoons. So again, as I think all of us probably agree in this room, we know that the greater frequency of natural disasters is being caused by climate change. And we need to start working to mitigate and reverse and slow climate change. Otherwise, there will not be a world to inhabit. As part of this, it's important for us as people of faith to acknowledge our own complicity in this problem, because we in the global West, and especially the global economic Northwest, are very wealthy, and we have greater carbon footprints than even those of us that live in the global West that try our hardest still have much greater carbon footprints than people who live in the global South. So we do take steps in our own lives, to use renewable energy in our homes perhaps, drive more efficient hybrid or electric vehicles, or completely eliminating or at least limiting our consumption of meat. We might even focus on purchasing organic and locally sourced foods for our daily lives. But I think one of the bigger questions is, when it comes to money, with the money we've been entrusted as people of faith, what steps can we take to invest with our values to address what is really the global climate change crisis? And I would venture to guess that everyone here tonight does practice some type of mindful living. Again, kind of what I talked about above as far as just acknowledging how can we change our own lives to really create change in the world, both environmentally and otherwise. I often wonder, how does our mindfulness translate in how we think about money? And I think a lot of us probably were raised with ideas of economy and thrift. But really, how do we go beyond that to, again, invest the money with which we have been trusted to align with our values? There's one way that in our world we talk about addressing climate change, and that's through what we call avoidance screening. And this is something you probably all have heard of. It really just means avoiding investing in companies with which we have moral, religious, or other qualms. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Basically, we are trying to avoid investing in companies with which we have moral qualms and that we would never patronize in our daily lives. So traditional investments use no avoidance screening at all. This would be some of your funds like from large companies like Vanguard or Fidelity. These companies invest basically in all companies across the gamut. Big oil, guns, weapons manufacturers, private prisons, something that's been in the news a lot lately, as well as alcohol and multinational tobacco companies. And we can see the different logos of these companies that I'm sure all of us are familiar with. My question, I guess, simply is, why should we invest in companies we find morally repugnant? A lot of people, I think, in the broader world, even in what is quote unquote the Christian world, would say, it doesn't really matter, we're not supporting them directly. But I think all of us, I think we do know better that if we're investing in them, we are supporting them. So I guess I just ask, is there a better way? And is it possible to make our investments more aligned with our values? So this brings us to fossil fuel-free investing. And many of our clients invest their money in what we call our fossil fuel-free models. And our definition of fossil fuel-free is avoiding investing in any company that has a revenue of 1% or more in the exploration, extraction, or production of fossil fuels. So we screen out producers of fossil fuels, and we take a stand by refusing to invest in these companies that really are some of the biggest drivers and culprits behind climate change. And so not only do we screen out these producers and extractors of fossil fuel, we also, again, screen out what I mentioned on a previous slide: alcohol, tobacco, and gun makers, private prison companies, and weapons manufacturers. This also goes beyond big oil. So we can divest out of big oil, but if there's still companies that are maintaining equipment, which some companies specialize in, it's still, again, contributing to the extraction of fossil fuel, oil, and natural gas. So our models, in this case, our fossil fuel-free models, also avoid investing in these companies that even service the machinery that extracts the fuel. But not only is there a component of what I just mentioned as avoidance screening, we need to really address climate change by affirmative screening. And this means investing in companies that produce renewable energy and fund and implement energy efficiency and sustainable infrastructure projects. Because as we all know, it's not enough just to stop investing in fossil fuel companies, because a lot of the damage has already been done. So we really need to start affirmatively investing in renewable energy in hopes that we can slow and hopefully eventually reverse climate change. One of the companies that we funds in our models invest in is a company called Hannon Armstrong. And actually a neat example of what Hannon does is in our hometown of Louisville, where the company has helped the city finance energy efficiency projects throughout the city, including in Metro City Hall. And Hannon Armstrong helped finance the installation of new boilers and power systems in City Hall. It's saved the city $2 million a year in energy costs. So not only are we assisting governments in energy efficiency improvements, and then thus reducing the government and the city's carbon footprint by making buildings more efficient, we're also saving the government money that they can use in other places to fund other local projects. So it saves energy and reduces the carbon footprint, but then the city is able to funnel the money they saved in the energy savings into other projects within the city. Another company that our models invest in is called Pattern Energy Company. I'll say something about Pattern here as a side note, but in 2018 alone, Pattern has 26 solar and wind projects and facilities, and they are located throughout the United States and Canada, and they have really had a significant impact. One impact was in 2018 alone, by virtue of investing in these facilities, they maintained Pattern prevented over 11 million tons of carbon dioxide emissions if you compare to had that power been produced by coal-fired electricity, and that's equivalent to keeping 2.4 million cars off the road. Not only does the wind and power production prevent the use of all of that carbon, but it also conserves 6 billion gallons of water, which is the equivalent amount used by 180,000 people, which is really quite significant when you think about that one fairly small company by Wall Street standards can have this big of an impact. And kind of an interesting thing, since I put together this slideshow, Pattern has entered into negotiations to be purchased by the Canadian National Government Pension System, which if it goes through illustrates that at least some other countries in the world are really being serious about addressing climate change. So that's just kind of a side note. And it's interesting that it's actually happened since I put the PowerPoint together, which was just like 2 weeks ago. So it just shows how quickly this area is changing. So not only do I want to talk about just avoidance screening and affirmative screening, which I've mentioned, but just about mitigating our own carbon footprints. I think we as a company, Just Money Advisors, and Andy and I as advisors, as part of a larger network of natural investments, we acknowledge that we ourselves do create a carbon footprint. Andy and I flew here today, of course, and we'll fly home later this week. And that releases a significant amount of carbon into the atmosphere. And we know that just by our everyday business, including occasional air travel, and I guess what we deem as necessary travel, and the energy we use at our offices, we ourselves, through our business, do have a carbon footprint. So what we've done as a company with natural investments is we've made a commitment to use some of our company resources to buy carbon offsets to help cancel out the carbon that we expend as a company. And our carbon offsets provider is a company called Native Energy, and they only work on carbon offset projects. The one that we've specifically directed our money to as a company is a project located in Honduras, where they're building a facility that will provide clean water to as it says, over 2,200 low-income households in rural Honduras. So while we work to mitigate our own carbon footprint, we're also helping provide easier access to one of life's necessities. And so I was kind of confused at first as to how this works. I thought, clean water, how is that offsetting carbon? And then I read more about it. So basically, if you live in rural Honduras or many parts of the world and you don't have access to clean water, the only way that you can produce palatable water is through burning of fossil fuels and wood. And so that releases over time a huge amount of carbon. And it also, in your household, if you have a house that's not well ventilated, it can be very bad for your lungs. So this project basically seeks to build this clean water facility to provide clean water to all of these households around it and provides jobs to people that work there, but also offsets the carbon that they would be releasing otherwise by producing clean water for themselves that they need to use in their daily lives. And one other interesting thing is, I'm not sure if you all are familiar with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, but this is, I guess, one that would focus on 3 different goals of theirs, which is number 3, good health and well-being. Number 6 is clean water and sanitation. And then number 8, decent work and economic growth. And so a project like this, really, it focuses on all 3 of those goals. And again, it's just kind of a win-win for everyone. Online resource Andy and I use is from a nonprofit called As You Sow. They really work in what we call shareholder activism, where they advocate for companies to change their policies in regards to how they run their companies, whether that be having more women and people of color on their boards, encouraging companies to have policies that implement transparency and political contributions and things like that. And so what As You Sow has created is a website called fossilfuelfreefunds.org. And you can basically, if you have an investment account, you can take any fund within that account, and if you can figure out, if you can put in the ticker symbol or even the name of the fund, you can see its carbon exposure. As You Sow also has other tools, including what are called gender equity funds. So they look at companies to see, are they really practicing what they preach? Are they bringing more women on board in their boardrooms? Are they implementing more equal pay policies and such like? They have another tool similar to the fossil fuel free funds tool that addresses whether companies are involved with deforestation. And then funds, are the funds gun free? Another one that's, are they weapon free, larger weapons? And then one that's tobacco free. So if you look at As You Sow's website, you'll be able to find all of these tools just to explore for yourself. In conclusion, I think we can and should do more to address climate change, and I really do believe the time to act is now. I think at this point we want to open up to questions about this.
In the beginnings of social investing, which started in the early 1970s, in the Vietnam Wars, a bunch of people created Poc's World Fund because they didn't want to invest in Dow Chemical that was making the napalm that was being used in Vietnam. Well, a lot of other things happened after that. But even early on, Wall Street laughed at people doing this kind of investment and said, oh, you sponge-headed liberals, you don't know what you're doing. And the reality is, now here about 30 years later, okay, I'll have to ask this. When I talk about the S&P 500, do most of us know what we're talking? Yep, okay, you can see mostly nods. That's basically the largest corporations of America, and that's the kind of the standard in which we measure how well we do. Well, there was a social investing standard called the DSI. And the people in this room will like it because that was created by a woman named Amy Dominy. And over those almost 30 years now, that index, so this is just, looking at index versus index, has outperformed the S&P 500 by a significant amount. Now, one caveat, one of the things in the DSI, which of those 500 companies in the S&P 500, they screen out, in other words, we talked about screening out for one reason or another, about 200 of those companies, which are about 40% of them. But the deal is, you won't be surprised because of what we've talked about today with fossil fuels. The Dominy doesn't have any of the big oil companies, none of the coal companies. Now they don't have much of the gas companies for various reasons, and those kind of things. So when energy does really well, the DSI and some social investments will underperform for a period of time when energy does real well, because we don't hold as much energy as everybody else does. But over 25 years, we've been able to make adjustments, do things, and we've learned to the point. And we have studies after studies after studies to show that socially screening does not have to necessarily influence your return. Now, we have a lot of people who consciously, in order to invest in affordable housing and a bunch of other stuff, are willing to take with some of their money a below market return. But that's a decision they made because they wanted to have more impact. The list is many firms. Many firms. The big names that you know of, like Merrill Lynch,
Morgan Stanley,
Fidelity,
Edward Jones,
those kind of people. What I was trying to do was making a comment that we have more independence than most people at those places do.
Yeah.
And that they have a list of mutual funds and a list of investments that they are supposed to go by. And it doesn't make any difference. You do what Merrill Lynch tells you to do. Now they give you the freedom of the list. But if the 3 fossil fuel free funds were not on that list, didn't make any difference how much they wanted to, they would say, I cannot buy that. Each company has their own list because they have arrangements with those companies. And part of that is understandable. But the reality is that that's why, I told people early on, I said, I don't want to work for Merrill Lynch and they don't want me. Because it was a different kind of arrangement we wanted. We wanted the freedom to, when new things came up. As an example, we've only really had the option of doing fossil fuel free for really on any scale for maybe 6 or 8 years at the most. And so when something else comes up, we now have something new that really relates to the question of fossil fuel too, we didn't really have time for, is green bonds. Do people know when I say green bonds, you know what I mean? It means they are bonds that are put up by big companies. Some big companies are doing great stuff. Bank of America is putting out a lot of green bonds. They are bonds that are basically being used to do green projects. So basically, if you buy those bonds, the more people that buy those bonds, the more they're going to put out there, and the more it's going to get done. And the green bond world is growing in leaps and bounds. And there is a very good green bond fund. If you guys wanted to do green bonds, that would be something we could help you do. And those are, so basically they're just like, it's like a fixed income, it's like a bond, only what it does are things all related to climate change and global warming.